unpacked, but we start off with those very important foundations, where today we're looking at the skill of questioning. Can I ask you a question, Rory?
Go ahead.
What do you know about the skill of questioning?
Why do you ask?
Notice all the questions going backwards and forwards.
Yes, well, I think it's interesting, and I'd like to pick up what you said at the top of the piece about it being appropriate questioning. You know, we both taught, Ken, and we both have very fond memories, maybe at level 2, of watching, foundation students, new students, use questioning, and sometimes it looks more like a police interview than it does a counselling session. And the key thing here is appropriate. And I think what I'd also observe is that different modalities of therapy have different questioning strategies. So in person-centered therapy, it's generally accepted, and there may be people who have differing opinions on this, so I'll acknowledge this, but we only use questions to clarify our understanding. In other words, when we're not sure of what a client is saying, so for instance, someone might say, well, she said that, and you may say, I hear you say she said that, but I just wonder who she is so I could understand that. It's to clarify it so that you're in pace, you're in step with the client, as opposed to using something maybe called Socratic questioning, where you're asking the client questions to readjust their thinking. And I think it's a bit of a skill, because I guess in our society, we are used to questioning in everyday life, aren't we, Kim?
We are. It is an interesting one here. And I think as many therapists as there are that many ways of looking at how appropriate questions are used. So I think that, and I'm going to speak from a person-centered perspective here. You know, you mentioned, Rory, that questions are only used within person-centered therapy to, I guess, align our frame of reference. So the whole concept here is that in person-centered therapy, you kind of going to step in as best you can to the client's frame of reference and see through their eyes what they're experiencing it, and then communicate that back. And it's only when we kind of become misaligned that we might ask a question to realign ourselves. But I still think, even with that definition, it is misused and misunderstood often. And I'm talking about from my perspective of how I view them. So I'll give you an example. You mentioned at the top, Rory, and then she said, so it may be a conversation. I went to the market with my mum and my sister, and then she really made me angry because she said blah, blah, blah. Well, who made you angry, the mum or the sister? So you may then go in and say, you know, I hear you say that she made you really angry. In this context, who is the she? And then my mother made me really angry. Oh, okay, now my frame of reference is aligned with you. I know we're talking about the mother. Yes. So there, I guess it kind of makes sense. But there's another area. And again, it's about us clarifying our perception. Maybe the client would make a noise. Maybe we'd say something and the client would go, oh. We can ask a question about that to clarify our understanding, because what does oh mean? So you might step in and say, now I hear when you're making that kind of sighing noise, something might be coming up for you. I wonder what that might be. That's a question, but it's a question that aligns you with the frame of reference of the client because they brought it in. And I think where it becomes inappropriate in person-centered therapy from the model itself is when we are satisfying our own need or want to know something. So I went to the market with my mum and my sister, and she made me really angry. And it was my mum who made me really angry. That's interesting you say that. How have you been getting on with your mum lately?
Yes.
Is an inappropriate question, because it's not from the frame of reference of that person, even though it may be in context. It's me wanting to know that bit of info.
Yes, and I think that brings us to the element that we've always discussed when we train together, Ken. Who is the question for?
Yep.
Is it for you to be able to better understand the client's frame of reference, better understand, the direction that they're looking at, if you want to use a more visual cue, or is it to satisfy our own curiosity? And if it's to satisfy our own curiosity, we're going down the rabbit hole of kind of entertaining ourselves. I think, client work is not, is not a soap opera or, a kind of tabloid headline. And I think sometimes we can be faced with clients whose stories you probably wouldn't even hear on a soap opera, because they are so difficult, so complicated. And sometimes, I've heard stories and I've said to my supervisor, I just don't believe that kind of thing happens. I'm not disbelieving the client, but it's just so new to me. And I think that when you become overly curious in the service of yourself, then what you're really doing is you're using the client to entertain you and to educate you. And I don't think that's what therapy is for. Therapy is about being the best for your client, being able to facilitate the client and in the direction they want. But you make a very good point. We should only use questions to clarify our frame of reference and understand where the client's coming from.
From a person-centered model. And of course, as you mentioned at the top of this, Rory, if you're working with a different model, there may be a requirement to ask questions. If you're working with CBT, for instance, you're going to be asking probing questions to understand and to get the person to think and describe what's going on for them. So it is model specific. And I look back to my time when I worked in drugs and alcohol, and when doing work in drugs and alcohol, certainly with the modality that I was practicing at that time, there were directive informing questions where I, as the therapist, needed information. I needed to know, have you been drinking this week? How much have you been drinking this week? How did that affect you this week? What impact did that have on your family? That's very directive and very probing, which is kind of contradicts what we've just said from the person-centered model, because it was 100% for my frame of reference. But there was a need to know from a risk evaluation perspective. And I think as soon as it comes to hidden risk, or when we're looking at risk, there are times where we'll need to ask directive questions.
Well, here we go, Ken, because what's happening is that when you're assessing risk, you're stepping out of the modality. What you're doing is you're doing a different piece of work. And, so somebody might come to you and say, I'm thinking of taking my own life. Good practice would be to ask them, do they have a plan? And if they say no, and you may then say, have you ever attempted to take your own life before? And they say no, you can pretty much say that there's no plan in place and the risk is lower. There's not no risk, but it's lower than you ask the same question to a client and they say, yes, I've got a plan. I've got some pills that I'm going to take when I get home. And I've attempted suicide. I've attempted to take my own life before. That ramps the risk up. So there are certain times where we have to use questions. And what I think this is? I think this is being part of a contemporary clinical practice. I think in the times when person-centered therapy was invented and evolving, it was a different era. It was a completely different era. And I just don't think they had that kind of mindset in place. We now have, we're now accountable for our clinical work. So sometimes we have to step out of the modality we're in to be able to assess and manage risk.
Definitely. So where risk is concerned, questions, the appropriateness of questions would change. And then I guess there's thinking that suggests that when we are working at depth with a client, and I think it was just last podcast when we were speaking about relational depth and what that is. So if you're interested in that, Counselling Tutor, that's our website. Go to the podcast tab. Today's episode is 214. And if you go to last week, that was 213, and you'll see all about relational depth there. When we are at depth with a client, when the client is in the process, they're in the zone, as it were, where they're right in the emotions of what they're presenting. They're refeeling it and bringing it into the here and now. They're using emotional words. When we ask a question, it can take the person away from that feeling into a thinking. It can move from I'm feeling to a cognitive process. Oh, hold on, let me think about that. And it can pull somebody out of the depth of the emotion of the presentation. So that's one of the things we need to be mindful of if we are using any kind of questions. And the questions that for me, which are inappropriate, are things like, have you tried, insert whatever you like here? Have you thought about blah, blah, blah? Have they ever? Could you not have? Those are the kind of questions that don't serve, other than to get the person to think about something and come away from the emotion that they're experiencing at that moment. And we're not there to rescue, specifically not if you're working from a person-centered model. You're not there to rescue. So we're not there to say, have you tried?
Yes, absolutely, Ken. And I think we talked a lot about person-centered therapy. Yeah. And we have to acknowledge there's other therapies. And certainly in cognitive behavioral therapy, there's a tradition of what's called Socratic questions, which I believe comes from the philosopher Socrates, who basically said, I know nothing. He said, I know nothing. And the way I find out is by asking questions. And I think, interestingly, in CBT, it's a deliberate questioning strategy is built into it. And one of the reasons is that with Socratic questioning, there is an amount of discomfort in the response to the question, because as you say, Ken, when you said to your client when you worked in alcohol services, you know, how much you've been drinking this week, that brings forward to the mind of the person exactly how much they've had to drink. Yeah. And it brings it into sharp relief. And I'm sure that when you ask that question for the right reasons, there was an amount of discomfort there as people are faced with the reality of what's going on for them. And in certain treatment pathways, it's only when people grasp the reality that they can make changes. So, you know, I think we have to be thoughtful that questioning itself is fairly benign. It's how it's applied within the modality. And CBT is all about changing our thoughts. It's basically classic CBT. You know, I know there's third wave CBT that integrates the emotional aspects. And I know a lot of CBT therapists would work on an emotional level. You know, they're not interrogators. But it does go to prove, doesn't it, that just the skill, just using questioning is so different within two specific modalities.
Yes. And of course, there are other modalities that are question-based, and it's about the appropriateness of that. If you're practicing within those modalities, you will be asking those questions for a very specific reason linked to theory that underpins why those questions are important. And I think that's the importance here, you know, and it's about what is your training, and what is the reason for the question. And we're not the experts at all. No. We're two colleagues. We're here discussing it, having a chat about topics that interest us, things that come up on our Facebook group. And we encourage you to ask these questions about questioning to yourself as well. What does questioning mean for you? Do you find that there are certain questions that might be quite directive that are effective? I don't know. Have the conversations. It's definitely a topic worth thinking about. And if you want to delve a little deeper, Rory has created what we call the super duper handout. I always call your handout super duper, Rory.
Thank you very much, Ken.
They
are super duper, though.
They're so concise. Rory has a special skill of taking lots of theory and just condensing it down into just the stuff you really need. And the handout is called Appropriate Use of Questions. It's available free of charge from counsellingtutor.com. Click on the podcasts tab, go to today's episode 214. There it is in the page. You can download Appropriate Use of Questions handout. Maybe use it with your peers if you're training. Stimulate a conversation about questioning.
Absolutely. And talking about peers, you've alluded to, of course, our Facebook page. If you want to join our Facebook community, if you go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor, you'll find us. We're a closed group. Knock on the door and our caring, lovely moderation team will let you in and join the party. with hundreds and thousands of like-minded people, students. There are qualified colleagues, supervisors, and also a lot of counselling lecturers in there, all talking about the world of counselling and psychotherapy. So pop yourself in there, and why don't you ask some questions in the group? You see what I did there, Ken?
I do. I tell you, this is like a laugh a minute, Rory. Me and you, anyway.